give us a brief overview of state medical marijuana laws?
At this moment, we have 37 states, as well as the District of Columbia, that have legalized the use of marijuana as a treatment for laundry lists of different medical conditions and symptoms associated with those conditions. Those lists vary a little bit from state to state, but they commonly include things like chronic pain. They include wasting syndrome associated with AIDS and HIV, nausea associated with chemotherapy, and more recently, a lot of states have added post-traumatic stress disorder to their list of qualifying conditions. So in these states, if you're an individual who's been diagnosed with one of those conditions, and if your physician has told you that your condition might benefit from the use of marijuana, then you are allowed, as a matter of state law, to use the drug, to buy it from a state licensed dispensary, possibly even to cultivate it yourself. Now, it's important to note that the federal government continues to ban marijuana outright. But for the last several years, especially with respect to medical marijuana, it stopped enforcing that ban. So as a practical matter, really those states that have legalized marijuana for medical purposes, their law is, practically speaking, the law of the land in those states.
Okay, and what's the definition, what's the legal definition of medical marijuana in those states?
It's a great question. So it's a grab bag. So generally speaking, marijuana refers to the cannabis plant and anything extracted from the cannabis plant that contains more than trace amounts of the psychoactive chemical Delta-9 THC. And we'll be talking more about that in a moment. But the products that you see in dispensaries in these states, the medical marijuana that you see, there's a lot of variety among those different products. There are a lot of different proposals before Congress. The latest one, there was a draft put out called the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act that was announced this summer. People were allowed to give comments on that particular piece of legislation. What all of these have in common is that they would legalize marijuana at the federal level, both for medical uses, but also for non-medical uses as well. But it's important to note that federal legalization wouldn't necessarily change state law. So I think all of these federal proposals would allow states like Tennessee to continue with their bans, outright bans on marijuana. And that's similar to the way that we sort of extricated ourselves from alcohol prohibition. The 21st Amendment was ratified back in the early 1930s. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that the last state, Mississippi, lifted its statewide prohibition on alcohol. So even though you could have federal legalization, you wouldn't necessarily see a lot more states legalize marijuana medically or otherwise. But federal legalization would have a big impact on the market. Because right now, in those 37 states that have legalized medical marijuana, the 17 or so that have legalized adult use marijuana, we have these very insular, odd bubble markets for marijuana. It's not traded across state borders, at least legally. So you go to Colorado, the stuff you see on the store shelves in Colorado is grown and processed in Colorado, not from some other state. And the big reason for that, I think, is that we have federal prohibition. And lots of states have said, we've got to keep this within our borders. Once that federal prohibition is lifted, I think you'll start to see the emergence of this new national market. And it probably means you're going to get a lot of really big companies that enter into the market and take over a lot of the space. And they're going to have economies of scale. They're going to be able to grow the plant cheaply in California and Oregon rather than in a warehouse in Michigan or Massachusetts. And I think you'd see the price of marijuana drop across the country. the price to consumers, which could raise some public health concerns. You might also be concerned that if you've got this concentrated market, maybe akin to tobacco or alcohol, those companies in that industry might be able to push back against sort of public safety minded regulations in the industry as well. So we will see changes to the economics of the industry. The people who are in the industry, there are some who are making money off this because each state is kind of granted them, in a lot of states, a state licensed monopoly or oligopoly. So in New York, for example, when they had just medical marijuana, there were only a handful of companies that were licensed to grow, process, and sell the drug. So if you got one of those licenses, you can make money off of that. It's tougher in other states like Colorado, where they have 1,000 companies right now that are licensed to grow, process, or sell marijuana. It's tougher to make a buck on this, and it's going to get a lot tougher the moment Congress legalizes, because you're going to be facing national competition out there.
We've got some folks that want you to make a prediction for what's going to happen in Tennessee with regard to legalization.
I'm skeptical that Tennessee will do anything in the near future. There have been a number of proposals put before the Assembly to legalize medical marijuana. Certainly not adult use. And that's the way most states have proceeded. They dip their toes in the water, legalize medical, and then turn to adult use. But each of those proposals, for various reasons, hasn't gotten the votes to get through. So I'd be surprised if it happened in the near term, although in the long term it could happen. One big difference between Tennessee and a lot of other states like Colorado and Oregon and California, so the pioneers in this movement, is that we don't have a ballot referenda process to speak of, where people could go around the legislature. That's how these things got done, especially in those early adopters, actually probably in the majority of states. It's easier to go around the legislature, get it passed popularly. You may not like what you get in the end, but we don't have that here. So I'd be surprised if we saw anything in Tennessee in the short term, but maybe 5 years down the line, 4 years down the line, certainly a possibility.
Historically, the war on drugs has adversely impacted minority and impoverished communities. How is the legal world thinking through addressing these inequities as they transition to legalization of marijuana and recreational marijuana nationally?
Yeah, it's a particularly big issue with recreational marijuana. So historically, Blacks and other minorities were arrested at 4 to 5, maybe even 6 times the rate as similarly situated whites for marijuana offenses. So the brunt of those marijuana arrests I talked about before, those fell disproportionately on communities of color. To try to deal with that going forward, states that are legalizing marijuana, they're really doing two things. One is they're looking back and they're saying, what can we do for those people who were in the past caught up in the net of prohibition and the war on drugs? So they might release individuals from prison who are still serving terms for marijuana offenses. They might expunge prior criminal convictions for marijuana offenses, because those, even an offense 20 years ago, a conviction 20 years ago can have lingering consequences for employment and so on. The other measure is more forward-looking. States, one of the big drivers of legalization are the new tax revenues. They're collecting a lot of tax money from marijuana sales, to the tune of billions of dollars when you put all the states together. So a lot of states are trying to take part of that money and reinvest it in these communities that have been disproportionately hit by the war on drugs, and invest it in infrastructure there, in schools and community centers and so on. Maybe even give some benefits to individuals in those communities in terms of getting licenses to grow and sell marijuana going forward.